Westgate Towers Part 5, looking at shadow particularly, shadow and light by implication. Light coming this way, so I've mixed up a slightly darker version, a bluer version of this colour, yellow-green with a little ultramarine. I'm looking at shadow on the left-hand side of this tree and trying to think of light areas as well as the dark areas. So just as much as focused on what you're not painting with this, because there's no white paint in theory to fall back on. Light, shadow, lights falling, coming in from the right, top right. So that means that there's very little shadow on this tree, some shadow on the lower branches, some shadow there from the building. But the bush here, that has good shadow on one side. Again, stippling, dabbing marks. Shadow doesn't necessarily block everything, doesn't cover everything, and certainly the edge of the shadow has got to relate to the surface. So I have added more detail. I've painted in the flag, I've put in more detail here, put in a little bit of colour on these boats and a little more description on the borders of these flowers. Just ordinary, typical watercolour painting, wet on dry, allowing the mix to dry, and then another layer. Just going to go around this figure here and try and isolate it. So the figures are important for the composition. Bit of grey on this red bush. Just a little bit more broken edge quality there. Light on this side. So we've got light coming from the right. Strong light has produced strong shadows. There ought to be a glimpse of those Gothic windows behind there. Branches. And quite strong cast shadows on the grass. And that's a colour that should relate to the sky ultimately, because that's where shadow comes from. So shadow is a coolish colour. So I've made up a deeper blue grey. That's ultramarine and a little cadmium yellow. Quite watery because it's meant to be a glaze, translucent glaze. And this corner of the border up here, that's in shadow. And there too. I'm just crossing this edge here. A little bit of shadow and then light in the sort of far distant. So these shadows come cast by this building, cut across, right across here, somewhere. Just looking at the alignment for this. It's obviously a particular time of day, and this is a glaze of that blue-green. Some gaps in the shadow. So just little streaks of sunlight crossing this lawn. Ultramarine and cadmium yellow. So the whole point about a glaze is to leave it alone. It's a once only thing. If I start brushing over that lots of times, it'll tend to merge with the colour underneath. So this shadow crosses over the flower bed and puts much of this foreground into shadow. Not all of it, some of it, and shadow on the left-hand edge of the flowers in here, perhaps. And shadows cast onto the path where the walkers are, by these bushes. So we've got a horizontal shadow which helps to describe that path, the space that the path is occupying. Another one just there. I have already painted this low railing using a number 3 round brush. Let's try and leave some gaps that are relevant there. A little bit of light. So we've got pools of light sort of crossing horizontally there, which help to describe that space. I think that's most of the shadow there. Over on this side, these bushes, I've got shadow on the ends of the bushes, it would seem, and on this low wall here is cast into shadow by that tree and blossom. It's only partly in shadow, so strips of light and shade in there, and more shadow on the ends of these bushes. There, perhaps. So the biggest area that's left to work on would be the river, and that's again building up with glazes. So I'm looking at the cast shadow of the bridge. It's difficult to tell, but it's doing something like this. I think coming across there, and there's some reflections of those trees going down into the river. A little bit of shadow there, perhaps, up in there. There's usually a dark edge on stone or concrete where water has perhaps the level's fallen back a little bit, and that just helps to define that edge. This is ultramarine and ochre. That's a fairly hard edge along there, and also on these punts. This side is much more deeply in shadow. There's a bit of something there, creeper actually, and there is some clues to the stonework here. So there's a bit of drawing to suggest stonework with the brush. Again with this ultramarine and ochre mixture. I don't want to put too much detail in, but there is something there. There's also a bit of algae, which is a greenish colour. I think sort of giving an impression of some jointing, algae in the jointing perhaps. Fairly dry, that makes, so I don't want it to get too wet. Should be a bit darker there. So I'm looking at the river and the reflections in the river, and building up gradually from dry to put on another glaze, perhaps of blue, thinking of this horizontal movement of the brush that suggests ripples or waves, small movement, gentle movement of water. Particular sort of blue, but it is reflecting the sky, and if this was all moving it would be harder to see these ripples, so in direct observation it would be a little bit more difficult. A bit of blue there, quite a vibrant blue. There's a reflection of a tree just here. Side to side movement of the brush. More vibrant blue, I suppose, coming down here. Quite a strong blue. some current in the water too. That's difficult to express. The gaps broadly are a bit wider nearer. So quite a lot of the surface area of this painting is water, and that's challenging because water is rather ephemeral. It sort of changes very easily according to wind, light, etc. Got some swirling marks on there. Ideally, let this dry off a bit. And then come back to it and work on it in stages. So there's a reflection there. This bit though is dry, greenish colour in the water. I'd like this brush to be a thinner point. So all these trees above here are reflecting in the water, slightly greenish. It's important not to sort of block that in completely. Let there be an impression of ripples or movement on the water. That's very bright there. We might switch to a flat brush. That might be better. Let's see if I can just slide that. I've got to have a bit of colour on it, of course. Move that from side to side. Not as good as the round brush. Glazing might be better done with a natural fibre brush like a squirrel or a sable. So reflections on this side, reflections of the tower, come down this side in this blue-grey. This is all a little bit darker in here, and there are several colours in the reflections, which I think I can only really do in, let's get that reflection coming straight down, so it should come straight down from there. Well, I can only really get the colour differentiation in on dry. Make some marks that relate to the surface qualities of the water. It's a bit of a scribble, but it's a horizontal sort of based scribble. So that, does it bend a little bit? It's much darker in there. I have to let that dry, and quite a dark edge where the water has, the level has fallen a bit, I think. It's there. On the other side, similar idea, slightly greener possibly. Building up. Try and make the brush more upright. Might be worth practicing that mark first. Somewhere else. broadly the river is moving very gently. So I painted in some of the reflections on the sides, and the fruit tree that's in blossom is also reflected in a sort of murky way. So directly below this tree, somewhere about there, I'm just make a few dots to guide the brush, and there too is a reflection of blossom. I suppose it's more or less a mirror from there. Yep, so that brings it down to here somewhere. Over to those marks. It's just a hint of that mauve colour from the blossom. Let's move those marks slightly. Bring this up. So I've got to keep looking at the empty shapes and particularly let light into this, because the ripples have colour on one side and then light on the other. Probably enough of that colour. There's maybe another colour for the reflection of the trunk of the tree, which should be a little bit lighter. It was rather too wet, that load of colour. Coming down there, there's some sort of reflection going straight down. A bit of light in there too, reflecting from that brightly lit bit of wall. I'm going to put another layer of ochre on this side. It is very brightly lit, but there's also staining on this wall, which picks up. This is dried off a bit more on the right, and there is a reflection of green from somewhere here, yellow-green. Let some of those still leave a sparkle there, because I've got to let some of the light into that. Maybe a little pale blue for the sparkle. Bit of light there. Tree in the middle that reflects downwards. So this tree here is reflecting down to about there. And again, just coming straight down, the reflection directly below the tree. Green, cadmium yellow and ultramarine. And that reflection is broken by the movement on the water. So that's just straight down from there. Going down to about there somewhere. Yeah. There is more light here reflecting from those buildings, and there is perhaps a little more detailed work to go in, and some further areas of shadow to add, as well as painting the figures. So there's shadow, mauvey grey shadow, some of it in there, breaking that up. There's a mauvish grey shadow on this side of this very ragged blossom tree. This side of it's in shadow. This is all quite brightly lit on the left, so there's a post there perhaps that needs revising, and I want to look at painting the figures in detail, which would involve going back to number 3 brush. Let's see if I can zoom into that area. I think it's important that this doesn't get overworked, and that could happen. The figures are quite significant, so I want to paint them in some colour that's plausible but won't look too outrageous. Give the lady a blue coat. And maybe dark blue trousers. Crimson and ochre make quite a good skin tone. I want to make them too jaundiced looking. Got to have a little bit of pink in it. I'm going to paint the whole of the head in that colour. No hands. Do we put red on the coat? Yeah, sort of burgundy red would be good. That's a deep red. Not to be confused with the bush though. Let's make that a little bit stronger. Any combination of colour would do, as long as it's not all the same, I think, and a little bit different from its background. So it's not quite the same as the colours that are around the subject. And give him some dark green trousers. And possibly hair. I think it's useful to paint the whole of the head, even though this is from a distance, in the same colour as the rest of it, and then paint the hair colour on top. In that way you get a little bit of the colour from underneath comes through. Somehow it's just a little more subtle than painting them separately. A little bit of yellow ochre there possibly. That's it. There are parts of this that need a little bit more work possibly, and I'm going to have a pause and think about that. There are some gaps to paint into, but broadly that's it. The glazing and working on wet on dry.